Welcome to Functional Philosophy, the show in which I, Charles II, explain and apply Ayn Rand's philosophy, objectivism. If you'd like to ask me a question on objectivism or its application, just go to charles2.com/contact. And my last name is spelled T as in tango, E as in echo, and W as in whiskey. To start today, I have two questions related to evolution, but I'm going to treat them as one, even though I think they came from different people. When I put questions down on my list, I don't note who they came from, so it would be a coincidence if they are from the same person. Alright, how did consciousness/reason/free will come into the first man? It doesn't seem like it comes through evolution, since only man has it, while all other animals lack it. Is it not an advantageous trait that should arise? This seems to point to the idea that consciousness did not come to man through natural means. Well, first of all, man is not the only organism with consciousness. There are forms of consciousness that aren't rational and don't involve free will. Do you think your dog is unconscious, non-conscious? Second, your premise that advantageous traits should be found in all species applies to much more than reason. Breathing underwater is valuable, right? So why can't human beings breathe underwater? Does that point to the idea that gills come from a supernatural source? No, it points to the fact that different species evolve in different contexts, and so they develop different traits to meet their needs. First of all, you can't say that something is an advantageous trait just because in our context it's advantageous. Maybe the physical prerequisites for consciousness involve the acquisition of so many calories that having consciousness isn't advantageous in certain contexts. That doesn't appear to be the case now. It doesn't seem as if we need so many more calories than non-rational organisms in order to maintain our lives, but evolution takes place over a long time. And so maybe there's some intermediate step during which the benefits of the incremental development toward reason are outweighed by the costs of requiring so many calories. I'm not saying that's how it is, but you can't look at something that's advantageous in one context and say, well, every animal should have this then. One, because you don't know if it is advantageous in that animal's context, at least given the requirements of evolution over millions of years. But also, even beyond this, even if it were true that all animals will exhibit reason eventually, there's such a thing as time. Maybe they just haven't gotten there yet. So what you are exhibiting is a laughable misunderstanding of natural selection and evolution. The theory of evolution does not claim that if a trait is valuable in some context, then all animals in all contexts should exhibit that trait at all times. Now, the next question related to evolution. During one of your discussions with Rucka, you say blacks in America are mostly animals. I assume you are using that word to mean they are not using the full function of their reason, as a lot of the functional reason required to pursue happiness has been taken from them by government providing too much and possibly other affirmative action policies. So, is it your opinion that blacks in America are only this way as a result of said policies? No, it's not welfare that has destroyed blacks. It is the ideas that led to welfare that destroyed blacks, partly through welfare itself, but not exclusively or even primarily through that. If you somehow were in a situation where blacks were provided welfare, but were exposed to rational philosophy, we would not have the problems we have today. Although welfare would still have some negative effect. The questioner goes on, so is it your opinion that blacks in America are only this way as a result of said policies, that anyone within America has the potential to pursue and achieve happiness? It sounded that way to me, and if that is your position, and you, like I, believe in evolution, as far as species changing over time / natural selection for life-affirming traits, I cannot reason past the obvious factor that if humans emerged from Africa, the groups that left would undoubtedly evolve at a faster rate and develop different survival traits as a result of facing countless new challenges to survival and constantly having to ascertain how to and what to eat in new environments. Conversely, the humans that remained in Africa would have experienced less new external pressures. In this sense, the only conclusion I am able to draw is that blacks have 100,000 years or more of a slower evolution. To me, this is a large part of the state of blacks in America. Well, then you, like the last questioner, are an ignorant moron. Evolution doesn't actually work the way it does in Pokemon. A Charmander doesn't inexorably evolve into a Charmeleon at level 16, and then into a Charizard at level 32. I think those are the right levels. I'm pretty sure 32 is when it turns into Charizard. I know these are Gen 1 Pokemon references, but I haven't kept up. The last ones I played were Ruby and Sapphire. They're good games. I don't have anything against them. I'd like to play them. I just have other priorities. In any case, that's not how evolution works. You are treating evolution like an intrinsic religious concept. Like there's some teleological spectrum behind the scenes, and creatures are advancing toward this perfect end state. No, that's not what's happening. Organisms develop traits to deal with their environments. They are not advancing toward some end state. So the fact that the human beings who left Africa face different selection pressures first doesn't necessarily mean anything. Maybe those selection pressures are superficial. Maybe it means that Northern Europeans can tolerate milk, whereas other kinds of humans are lactose intolerant. So you have no idea if these selection pressures would even impact our ability to reason. But also, you don't know if it's the opposite of what you're claiming. It could be that these new selection pressures are such that they inhibit reason for whatever reason. Maybe the people who stayed in Africa are smarter because once you went out into the coldness of Europe, survival required the development of certain traits that, for whatever reason, are inimical to the development of reason. You know, human beings continued to develop larger and larger heads until we couldn't fit through the birth canal when we were being born. So just to make something up at random, maybe when you go into colder climates, you have more of a need for heating, and there's some reason that a heating element would develop in your head, and that crowds out some of the space that would otherwise be taken up by the brain, and so survival in those environments makes you dumber. Now, I just made that up, but the point is you can't deduce that, oh, well, new selection pressures means I leveled up, I got 5 more levels toward evolving into a Charmeleon. No, that's not how it works. Now, there is a relationship between these two questions. They both consider evolution in religious, supernatural terms. And it's not a coincidence that the second guy is racist. Religious thinking breeds racism because it breeds tribalism. God gave the special revelation to this particular race, or the godlike supernatural process of evolution made some of us better than others, despite the empirical fact that regardless of how different anyone recognized as a human may be from anyone else recognized as a human, we are all capable of reason. You see that this is evaded here. What would it matter if it were true that white people evolved toward some further end state in a way that other races hadn't? That would change nothing about what we see in fact is true about all races. There is no race whose members are dumb enough such that they should be treated like irrational animals, because they're not irrational animals. But that is all evaded here. It's supernatural process, God, differentiated these groups, so it's okay to be bigoted toward them. Wrong. Next question. I currently serve in the British Armed Forces, but it is a long-term aspiration of mine to become a philosopher, and hopeful one day teach it at an academic level. Before I get to the second part of this question, I am going to comment on this. The way you wrote this raises a red flag. You say your aspiration is to become a philosopher. That is a bad sign. A first-handed person doesn't usually think about his goals in terms of the title he wants. He would say something like, I want to teach philosophy. I want to figure out the basic nature of the universe and man's place in it and explain it to other people. He wouldn't say, I want to be a philosopher. In the vast majority of cases, speaking that way is a result of second-handedness, of a desire to attain a title that other people respect. Now, maybe you have some legitimate interest in philosophy too, but if you also have a second-handed desire for status and prestige, then that desire is going to crowd out your legitimate first-handed interest. Those two cannot coexist. Not in the long run. A novelist doesn't think, I want to be a novelist. He thinks, I want to write this specific story. A first-handed person thinks in terms of what he wants to do, not in terms of the title he will gain. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible that you would ever think in terms of your title as a first-handed person. Ayn Rand wrote a bunch of stories when she was young, and so, at a certain point, she might have said, well, I want to be a novelist. That's what integrates what I'm doing here. She wouldn't have started out that way, but after a certain point, which could happen at a relatively young age, she might have spoken about it that way. But even then, you see that she still described what she wanted in terms of what she actually wanted to do. It wasn't just, I want to be a novelist. It's, I want to present an image of the ideal man. That's what she wanted to do, not be a novelist, not have a certain title, but to do a specific thing, a consequence of which would be her having the title of novelist. So if you find yourself characteristically thinking about what you want to do in detached, abstract, rationalistic terms, that is a sign of second-handedness. And the connection is that a first-handed person gets his abstractions from his own observations of reality, whereas a second-handed person just adopts ideas from other people. And so rationalism is a form of second-handedness. If you're not getting your abstractions from reality, where are you getting them from? Well, someone else. And so this desire to have this title is really a desire to have a certain status in other people's consciousness. It's social metaphysics. You don't care about doing a certain thing and then gaining the title as a consequence. You care about having the title as an end in itself, and then in order to justify that, you'll do some philosophy to flesh it out and make it seem like you really are a philosopher. But that's not really what you want. You want the title. No. Real happiness comes from having a first-handed desire to do something, and treating the abstraction as the secondary thing it is. Whereas unhappiness, chronic dissatisfaction comes from trying to achieve a title as an end in itself. I'm not saying a title can't be any pleasure to you. I call myself a philosopher. I take pleasure in that. I think it's important to take pleasure in the abstract description of states you've earned, but I take pleasure in that because I know I earned it by my own judgment. I don't care if other people call me a philosopher. It would make no difference to me if literally every human being on the planet and in the International Space Station, every human being everywhere, uniformly held the view that I, Charles II, am the person least deserving of the title philosopher. That would make no difference to me. Because my pleasure in contemplating myself as a philosopher doesn't come from other people's thinking of me that way. It comes from the fact that that's what I am, that that's what I've earned. Now, if you can't say that, if it would make a difference to you that other people didn't grant you the title you desire, then you're not being first-handed. So you should think long and hard about what's actually motivating your aspiration to become a philosopher. And unless having that title in other people's minds means nothing to you, and having it in your own mind is a derivative of doing the actual work that a philosopher does, then you should consider aspiring to some other career. And now for the actual question, which was long and I rephrased. How do you think one should study the history of philosophy, chronologically or comparatively? Now, I did rephrase this in my own words and cut out a lot from this question, which does not contradict the policy I explained before of reading questions as I get them so that you know what I'm responding to. Because the way I do this is when I get a question, I reformulate parts of it or cut out parts of it long before I actually reach the question in my list of questions. So by the time I've gotten to it, all I'm responding to is the version of the question I have created. I don't even remember what this question said. So I do edit questions some, but when I actually respond to them, you can still be confident that I'm not responding to anything that you aren't hearing or seeing, because I cut that stuff out long ago and don't remember what it was. So chronologically or comparatively. By comparatively, he means should you study the metaphysics of Plato and then the metaphysics of Aristotle and then the metaphysics of Kant and go by branch, or should you do all of Plato, then all of Aristotle, etc.? And the answer is chronologically, without question. You want to get a sense of integration of how the different branches of philosophy connect, how one idea leads to another. And you won't get that if you are treating each branch of philosophy separately. So you want to look at Plato's whole philosophy. Then you can move on to Aristotle, and any good historian of philosophy will compare Aristotle's metaphysics to Plato's, etc., but you will have already seen the whole integration of Plato before you move on to Aristotle. I recommend W.T. Jones, A History of Western Philosophy. That is the undisputed champion of history of philosophy books, at least for laymen. It was originally a single volume divided into 3 parts, the classical mind, the medieval mind, and the modern mind. It has since become 5 individual volumes, the first 3 being those 3 parts, and then 2 more. And each part has had revisions. I haven't compared and contrasted every version of every volume. In general, older history books of any kind are better. But on the other hand, older books have access to less knowledge. They don't have the cutting-edge knowledge. And of course, over time, organizational improvements are likely to be made. I know Jones reorganized the book in later versions. So you have to make your own judgment on which version of those books is likely to be the best. In any case, one good history of philosophy book like that is all you need, certainly as a layman, and I think it's all a philosopher needs. A philosopher does not have to read the Critique of Pure Reason cover to cover, and certainly a layman doesn't have to. The only person who has to do that is a scholar of Kant. Peikoff says Ayn Rand did her due diligence by reading one history of philosophy book, the standard one at the time, which isn't even as good as W.T. Jones. So, despite what the Ayn Rand Institute will tell you, you do not have to go into an in-depth study of all of the major philosophers in order to understand the history of philosophy or objectivism. ARI put out an article a few months ago exhorting people to study the history of philosophy lest they misunderstand Ayn Rand and objectivism. The exclusive purpose of this article was to undercut the enthusiasm of proponents of objectivism by implying that you had to meet this onerous standard if you are actually going to understand Ayn Rand and competently promote her philosophy. In fact, I saw shortly after that article went up a Facebook post of someone reading the Critique of Pure Reason cover to cover, and he explicitly stated that he was inspired by that article to do so. Now, you may say that this person just misinterpreted what the author of that article intended, but that's not the case, because the author of that article liked that Facebook post. So that is exactly the effect he intended to have. Now, reading the Critique of Pure Reason is a waste of your time. Reading a 20 to 50 page summary of Kant's philosophy in a good history of philosophy is, I would say, conservatively 100 trillion times more valuable than reading the Critique of Pure Reason. But people are often not inclined to read a summary of that kind for two main reasons, I think. One is because of the encouragement of corrupt organizations like ARI, but two, because of second-handedness. Because you're not going to impress anybody by saying, I read a summary of Kant. But if you tell somebody, oh yeah, I read the Critique of Pure Reason, oh wow, that's impressive, you're a real intellectual. It doesn't matter that you will have understood almost none of it, and that the summary will grant you incredible understanding if it's good. No, it sounds impressive, so I'm going to do that. Because I don't really care about ideas, I care about impressing other people. If you're interested in philosophy, get W.T. Jones' History of Philosophy and read that, and then you will be good to go. If you think about it, of course. I'm not saying you can just slide your eyes over the pages and then you'll be good. One thing that has become clearer to me in recent years is how little reading actually matters. What made Ayn Rand a unique genius was not that she read more than other intellectuals. She probably read more than most people, but not more than most intellectuals. She probably read much less. She was, like I am, a slow reader, but a thoughtful one. And it was that thoughtfulness that made the difference, not her absorbing of massive amounts of text. So I'm not saying reading W.T. Jones will guarantee you great insight, but it is all you need in order to generate great insight. Next question, is greed a legitimate concept? Well, once again, this is a question Peikoff was asked on his podcast, and I agree with his answer, but let's go at this from the ground up. What do people mean when they say greed? Well, the way most people use it, greed seems to refer to the desire for massive short-term gain or action based upon that desire. Now, is this a legitimate aspect of existence to conceptualize? Yes. It's important to have a name for a strong desire that is nonetheless a sacrifice. Now, you might say, well, there's sacrifice versus gain. What other distinction do you need? Well, there are different levels of sacrifice. For instance, if somebody offers you a nickel in exchange for giving up your career, well, accepting that nickel would be a sacrifice, but it's not tempting. Whereas if somebody offers you $1 billion to give up your career, that would still be a sacrifice, but it would be prima facie tempting. And so acknowledging that there are kinds of sacrifices that are nevertheless psychologically motivating until you summon the full context. I suppose a way to define this would be a kind of sacrifice that requires the summoning of one's full context in order to quash. That kind of thing exists, and it really is different from sacrifices that nobody would make because they're not tempting. But the thing is, we already have a word for that, and it's called temptation. So then what is greed? Is that just duplicating temptation? No. Greed has the connotation of it's selfish, so it's bad. The idea with greed is any form of self-interest is a form of temptation, because what's good is to be selfless, and so self-interest is per se temptation. Now that is obviously invalid. So in that sense, I would say greed is illegitimate, and the proper concept that people sometimes use greed in place of is temptation. However, I do think there is a rational use of greed. Greed is often used to describe insatiable desire. I want more of this than I can possibly attain. I have unlimited desire. I'm greedy for money. That means I won't just be happy with $1,000, $1 million. I want as much as possible. I always want more. I always want my business to grow. I'm greedy for it. Now, I think greed has to be an active, actually felt emotion. You wouldn't say somebody's greedy just because he wouldn't turn down more money. It's only greed if he actually feels strongly that positive desire for more in a way that can never be satiated. And that's a legitimate kind of feeling. I mean both that it's a kind of feeling that does actually exist, and also there's nothing wrong with it. It's fine to feel greed. I think all good, productive people do feel greed. Greed for progress in their chosen career, anyway. So yes, greed is a legitimate concept if you use that word to refer to unlimited desire. It is not legitimate if you use it as an anti-egoist corruption of the concept of temptation. If you'd like to keep up with everything I do, just go to charles2.com. If you'd like to enable me to do more, just go to patreon.com/charles2 and become a supporter. Thanks for listening.